Welcome to the deep dive. Forget scrolling, we do the digging for you.
Yeah, we find the core insights.
And today, our mission is pretty focused. Understanding those fascinating cultural differences between the U.S. and Japan. We're using our sources directly.
We're covering a lot, right?
Yeah.
Communication, thinking patterns, social stuff.
How people see themselves, the world, it's quite a range.
Definitely.
Think of this as your express pass, really, to
Right.
grasping some fundamental distinctions. We'll go chapter by chapter using plenty of examples from the material.
Exactly. We're diving into those communication styles, the underlying thought processes, how relationships work.
And those deep perceptions of reality and self.
Yeah, unpacking the core contrasts, we'll try to highlight those aha moments with clear, real-world examples as we go.
Okay, let's dive right in then. Chapter 1. It kind of lays the groundwork. It points out that a lot of cross-cultural friction, well, it comes down to differences in how people act, think, their assumptions.
And their core values, absolutely. The source starts quite broad, actually. It mentions that Americans traveling often notice certain patterns in places like Africa, Asia, Latin America.
What gets lumped together is non-Western, basically.
Right. And a really key idea here, a foundational one, is this difference between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft societies.
Okay, break those down for us.
So, Gemeinschaft. Think of that as a strong community feel. Tradition, close relationships, they really shape how people interact and see reality. It's very interpersonal.
Right, community-based.
Uh,
And Gesellschaft.
That's more about objective reality, often driven by markets, individual goals, more impersonal structures, you could say.
Interesting. And the source uses Gemeinschaft to contrast Mexican culture with American culture.
It does. It highlights how American culture leans more towards that objective Gesellschaft way of being.
So even close by, you see that contrast.
Yeah.
America leans Gesellschaft, objective. And Japan, as we'll explore, seems much more rooted in those Gemeinschaft, relationship-based values.
Absolutely, that tension, that difference, it's going to pop up again and again in communication, relationships, worldview.
The source gives some historical context
Yeah.
too, right? Something about technology.
Yeah, it touches on things like gunpowder, steel. They actually came out of China around the same time as the West, but the West developed them much faster.
Why was that?
Part of it was societal structure. Power was more spread out in Europe, whereas China had more centralized control back then. That strong community focus, the Gemeinschaft in China, kind of kept those market forces, the Gesellschaft, in check for longer.
Okay, so Europe shifted faster towards that market-driven society.
Pretty much. Things like, well, war, especially after gunpowder, changed things, and trade really pushed Europe away from the traditional Gemeinschaft model much quicker than what happened in China, which had a more balanced development historically.
But it's not just a simple East-West split, is it?
Not at all. That's a crucial point. Non-Western societies aren't all the same. The source uses Thailand as an example. You see strong Gemeinschaft, community structures, especially rurally. But individually, Thais can have a very autonomous sense of self, almost like you'd expect in a more Gesellschaft culture. It's complex.
And that complexity brings us right to Japan. Like America, it's highly industrialized. You'd maybe expect pure individualism.
But the source really stresses this. The Japanese predominantly define themselves in relation to other people. That relational aspect, that sense of belonging, obligation, it's key. We'll see it constantly.
Okay, that's a major theme to watch.
Definitely. And the chapter ends with some really solid advice, especially for Americans going abroad.
Which is?
Understand your own cultural assumptions first. Before you can really get a handle on another culture, like Japan's, you need to be aware of those often unconscious beliefs driving your own behavior.
Like looking at your own glasses before trying to see through someone else's.
Exactly that. You need to know your own lens.
Okay, let's move into chapter 2. Cultural patterns of perception and thinking. Starts with a big idea, doesn't it? Different cultures might actually have different ideas of what reality is.
It's pretty profound, yeah, based on fundamentally different assumptions.
And the main contrast drawn is?
Well, it contrasts the typical American view of reality as objective, material, often kind of separate from spirit, with more animistic views you find in many non-Western cultures.
Animistic meaning.
Meaning nature isn't just stuff, it has life force, spirit. Everything's interconnected, has its own essence.
And the example given is how we relate to the environment.
Right. The source points to an American tendency to see the environment as a resource, something to be used, maybe even exploited. Whereas in many Indian or Southeast Asian cultures, the emphasis is much more on harmony, on integrating humans into nature, not standing apart from it.
A very different starting point for sure.
Then the chapter brings in this idea of figure and ground in perception.
Like in a picture, what you focus on versus the background.
Exactly. What one culture brings to the foreground as important, another might just see as background noise almost. It literally affects what we pay attention to.
And the language example. Two keys.
Yeah, the Trukees language apparently having one word, ara, for both blue and green. It's not that they can't see the difference.
But the language doesn't make that distinction primary.
Precisely. They learn the difference when they learn English. It shows how our cultural frameworks, embedded even in language, shape our perceptual boundaries.
So basic physical perception might have some variation, but the bigger cultural differences are in how we categorize things mentally.
That's what the source suggests, yeah. Those abstract artificial categories our thinking creates, that's where culture really makes its mark.
Okay, so let's talk thinking styles. Americans focus on.
Functional, pragmatic application. How can we use this? What does it do? Very practical.
And the Japanese.
Much more towards concrete description, really focusing on the specific details of what's right there.
And Europeans.
Often emphasize abstract theory, the underlying principles.
So Americans doing applying. Japanese seeing describing. Europeans abstracting.
That's a good summary of the source's point.
Mm-hmm.
And it directly impacts how they approach problems, how they communicate.
So Japanese thinking is closer to perception, Europeans closer to symbolism.
Right. And Americans are kind of in the middle with that strong practical bent.
And this links to nonverbal communication.
The source suggests it does. Because the Japanese are maybe more attuned to that analog perceptual level, they tend to be more sensitive to nonverbal cues, the context, the subtle signals.
Whereas Americans rely more on the words themselves, the digital message.
Generally, yes, more focused on the what and how of getting something done, maybe less on the who is doing it or the surrounding nuances.
What about the American view of facts?
Very action-oriented. The belief is that rational thought is based on objective reality, things you can measure, results you can see. It's about what works.
Which contrasts with Japanese decision-making.
Quite a bit. The source notes the Japanese often don't systematically weigh lots of alternatives like Americans tend to. It's more intuitive.
Ah, the hotel story.
Yeah, that's a great illustration. The American diligently getting costs for 4 hotels for a feasibility study.
And the Japanese colleague is just confused, like, why 4? We just need the best one.
Exactly. It perfectly highlights that different mindset about planning and uncertainty. Americans are generally okay working with probabilities, projections.
Like in manufacturing percentages or quality control sampling?
Right. But the Japanese approach, as described, is much more grounded in concrete reality. Production figures are exact counts. Quality control often means inspecting every item, not just a sample.
Seeing sampling is less reliable.
Yeah, and responsibility for quality is often right there on the line with each worker.
There's another example, the Scandinavian surveyor in Japan.
Right. Assessing risk. It showed the Japanese preference for solid precedents for established rules over purely probabilistic analysis. They're much more comfortable with what's known and proven than with speculating about uncertain futures.
Interesting. And American European thought is future-oriented, but mainly the near future.
That's the tendency highlighted, yeah. Like business planning cycles 6 months to a year out. Different from cultures maybe more focused on the deep past or the immediate present.
The source also mentioned American functional thinking, focusing on avoiding failure.
Yeah, kind of getting around barriers, finding a way to make it work, even if it's not the absolute perfect way, maybe. More about getting the job done successfully than striving for abstract excellence sometimes.
And no logic. What's that about?
It's this idea, prominent in American thinking, that a claim isn't really valid until it's proven true. You don't just accept it.
So show me the proof.
Pretty much. And the American application emphasizes anticipating consequences, being proactive, having a designated problem solver, balancing risk assessment with optimism.
Contrasted with European reasoning, valuing theory more.
That's the distinction made, yes.
The traffic sign example is great too.
It really is tangible. American signs guiding you towards a destination sometimes miles ahead. Think DC airport signs.
And Japanese signs in Tokyo often confirm your choice after the last turn.
Yeah, basically labeling the road you're now on when it's the only option left for your destination. Guiding versus confirming.
Then there's the implied agent, the American need for a cause, someone responsible.
Right. Things don't just happen. Someone or something made them happen. Even our language structure often demands a subject like, it is raining.
And this why focus can cause issues with Japanese colleagues.
Sometimes, yeah. The source mentions American managers in Tokyo getting frustrated when asking why about a delay.
Like the customs delay example.
Exactly. The Japanese assistant gave loads of detail about Yokohama customs procedures, but didn't pinpoint the specific cause of that delay in the way an American would expect.
So Japanese explanations might give context, but not necessarily a direct linear cause and effect chain.
That seems to be the observation. It can feel more circular or holistic compared to the American linear operational approach.
Which leads to American analytical thinking, breaking things down into causes and categories.
Yep. Contrasted with more synthetic or holistic thinking, often seen in Japan, China, Brazil, seeing the interconnectedness of things more.
And the chapter ends with Rosalie Cohen's research on conceptual styles, analytical versus relational.
Right. Analytical style, dominant in the U.S., focuses on breaking things down. Relational style, more common elsewhere and in some U.S. communities, emphasizes social context and relationships.
And U.S. institutions tend to favor the analytical style.
That's Cohen's point, yeah, which can create challenges for people who naturally think more relationally.
Okay, chapter 3. Language and nonverbal behavior. Starts with the Whorf hypothesis. Language influencing thought.
Yeah, but the source leans towards the weak version language influences, doesn't rigidly determine thought.
And it talks about counting systems.
Right. English mostly has one system.
Yeah.
But Japanese and Turkese have multiple systems that classify objects by shape. Long things, flat things, round things are counted differently.
That's wild. Suggests a richer experience with objects, maybe.
Potentially. The source even hints it might relate to the Japanese aesthetic appreciation of objects. And they count people totally differently from objects, too.
Raises questions about objectively quantifying human behavior.
Definitely. Language also shapes our sense of space. English has lots of specific boundary words, making space feel more concrete. Other languages might have fewer, making space more abstract.
And language and social relations, the you pronouns.
Big difference there. Thai and Japanese have elaborate systems reflecting relative status.
Right.
You're constantly aware of hierarchy linguistically.
Unlike American English with just one you.
Exactly. European languages are kind of in the middle, usually with a formal and informal you.
How about rules and authority in language?
American society tends to use language negatively for rules what not to do, with specific punishments. Other cultures, like Chinese or Brazilian, might focus more on prescribing desired actions.
Americans value clarity, but English can be ambiguous.
Yeah, we aim for clarity for action, but inherent ambiguities exist, like non-specific adjectives and questions.
Moving to nonverbal behavior, it's seen as more trustworthy.
Often, yeah, because it's less consciously controlled. Things like tone, pitch, stress paralanguage are crucial.
And Americans rely on pitch changes within sentences.
Generally, yes. Falling pitch at the end is normal, but a sharp drop can sound demanding. This doesn't always translate.
Like with Chinese, where pitch changes meaning within words.
Right. Or a flat sentence end pitch might sound abrupt to an American, even if it's standard for the speaker. Misinterpretations happen easily with British, German, Latin paralanguage too.
And what's important nonverbally in one culture might be missed in another. Figure ground again?
Exactly. An American rising inflection implying criticism might be totally missed by someone from Southeast Asia.
Or the example of black versus white communication cues and arguments. Different focus on distance versus tone facial expression.
Right. The key is every culture has its own nonverbal code. You can't assume universality.
Okay, chapter 4, form of activity. Starts with the American focus on action needing an agent, a cause.
Yes, that fundamental belief that someone or something has to be doing the action. Things don't just unfold.
Which contrasts with Japan, where actions can seem more spontaneous behind the scenes.
That's the description. Decision makers or responsible parties might be less visible, operating more through the group, the network. Americans look for the prime mover. Japanese might operate through a medium.
And individual decision-making. Big in the U.S.
Hugely. From a young age, it's about thinking for yourself, deciding what you want. Even expert advice is just input for your own final decision.
Experts are resources, not the deciders.
Right. And personal preference often equals aesthetic judgment. I like it, therefore it's good for me. Very self-centered, in a way.
Contrasting with non-Western cultures where decisions might be made by those in traditional roles or by groups.
Exactly. Like parents arranging marriages or group consensus being paramount.
Americans expect to voice opinions in groups, value procedures like agendas, voting.
Very much so. It's about fairness, ensuring everyone gets a say.
But Japanese consensus is different, more like feeling out the leader's view.
Often, yes, a more subtle process. And implementation can be very fast once that consensus is reached.
Though the source cautions that unanimous Japanese decisions might mask power dynamics, not always be pure egalitarian agreement.
That's an important nuance mentioned, yeah. It's not always what it might seem to an American observer.
Interestingly, the way American doctors diagnose by matching symptoms to disease categories.
Is actually similar to how many non-Western societies apply pre-existing principles to situations.
Like the Cambodia example, reclassifying accidents from fate to human cause to enable first aid.
Right. It shows how framing or classification enables action, and it highlights a non-Western reluctance for individual decisions, preferring group responsibility.
Let's talk about the value of doing. Americans value visible accomplishment, being busy.
Highly. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. Heroes are doers. Being active is praise. Retirement is seen as becoming inactive.
Contrasting with being or being and becoming.
Yes, where spontaneous expression or personal development might be valued more, contemplative people might get more respect than just busy people.
And control. Americans prefer direct control via skills, technology.
Generally, yes, primary control. The Japanese tend to mediate activities more through situations, human relations, prioritizing the group harmony, secondary control via the group.
Like avoiding direct worker-manager conflict, striking at lunchtime.
That's the kind of example given, yeah.
Time orientation next.
Yeah.
American time thrift, traced back to colonial Virginia.
And Benjamin Franklin, time is money. Mass-produced clocks help too, enabling efficiency, coordinating schedules.
And this focus leads to measuring productivity by time deadlines, sometimes over quality.
That's the potential downside highlighted. Deadlines can cut short discussion or coordination. And again, the focus is often the near future.
Right. Moving to Chapter 5. Form of social relations. Starts with social status. Americans see themselves as egalitarian middle class.
Broadly speaking, yes. Less overt influence from background, money, power, compared to, say, Germany, Britain, or Japan. Social life can seem less permanent, less deep in terms of hierarchy.
And this can cause issues internationally, like the German guests example.
Exactly. An American hostess might not realize the social awkwardness of mixing guests from vastly different strata because that sensitivity isn't as ingrained.
Equality is a huge theme. We're all human. Horizontal relationships.
Very much so. Even in hierarchies like the military, there's pressure to act egalitarian, avoid pulling rank.
Complimenting high-status people as regular guys.
Right. Which makes it hard for Americans to grasp, say, deep respect for impoverished aristocrats elsewhere or faceless leadership like in Japan.
Speaking of Japan, business grew modeled on households.
With really precisely defined relationships, Americans focus on the individual first, then their role, which can lead to social blunders.
Like the consultant visiting Neon. Prioritizing the wrong manager based on rank, not relationship.
Yeah, messing up his social obligations. Americans tend to ignore those differential treatment expectations, focusing on personal liking and equality.
Social obligations differ too. Western reciprocity, Dutch treat.
Which can seem crass elsewhere. Relationships without obligation might feel insignificant in many cultures.
And Japan has complex gift-giving reflecting deep, lasting obligations.
Absolutely. Losing face is a big deal if you don't acknowledge or repay. Maintaining goodwill creates dependency. American relationships reveal the individual. Non-Western ones reveal the network.
Confrontation. American directness versus Japanese indirectness.
Classic contrast. Japanese prioritize harmony, avoiding embarrassment, unwritten rules about what's observed or discussed.
American greetings brief, others more elaborate, reflecting social structure.
Right. Americans can seem brusque by skipping those formalities, and Japanese need to know status to even choose the right language.
Friendship. American friendships are often based on shared activities, spontaneity.
Yeah, doing things together, often separate from deep obligations, maybe more superficial by Gemeinschaft standards. Compartmentalized, too. Work friends, gym friends.
Best friend might be more nostalgia than deep dependence.
That's suggested. And a reluctance to deeply involve friends, maybe preferring professionals for big problems.
Different from French-Russian friendships, less competitive, longer lasting, involve families.
Yes, and the French even have a word, brouille, for reconciling temporary breakdowns.
Individualism versus group orientation. Americans see self as unique, but categorize others. leads to impartiality.
Whereas the non-Western divide is often between one's own network and everyone else, leading to personalized relationships within the network paternalism, nepotism.
So Americans value impartial leadership, objectivity in hiring.
Right. Cooperation is often for practical goals, not necessarily deep group commitment. People might leave if expectations aren't met.
Role specialization. Americans like clear roles for efficient.
Yes. Can struggle with unclear authority or mixed planning operations roles abroad. Trying to impose American structures on a scriptive cultures often fails.
Even the role of a sick person differs. Marginalized in the U.S., may be privileged elsewhere.
Like the Eritama example, where being sick excused you from obligations, gave you a defined social position.
Okay, Chapter 6. Perception of the world. Starts with humanity and nature. Americans see humans as unique, with a soul.
Weston, yes. A view separating humans from a more material, mechanistic, natural world. Science and tech elevate humans.
Contrasting with cultures seeing humans as just one part of a living animistic nature.
Where objects can have essence, no sharp human nature divide. Think Hindu-Buddhist cycles of life, souls in various forms.
This Western American view fosters objectivity, science, tech.
That's the argument. Though Japan shows that subjectivism doesn't prevent tech development, maybe due to other factors like congeniality, concrete perception.
Materialism and property. Americans abroad judged by U.S. material standards.
Often, yes. Promoting things like latrines or vaccines, which might not be immediately valued locally if cultural assumptions differ. Preventative health relies on assumptions not always shared.
Progress. American belief in continuous progress, linked to tech, detachment from tradition.
Yeah, and this isn't always welcomed elsewhere. Can be seen as a threat, like the example of Iran.
The source critiques the underlying American view of rational man, separate from nature. Economics is key.
Suggesting it's led to failures in some development projects. The American commitment to technicism, simplifying things with tech, is seen as unparalleled.
Like the roundabout versus traffic circle example, judgment versus simple signals.
Right. American progress also involves less emphasis on traditional life transitions, birth, death, etc. Less social marking, less social control.
Optimism, based on unlimited good, enough for everyone.
Contrasting with Foster's image of the limited good, the idea that resources are finite, one person's gain is another's loss.
And progress links to linear time, past to future, importance of keeping up, near-future focus.
Exactly. This underlies health measures abroad to prevention, stats. But explaining vaccines or clean water can be hard if people aren't future-oriented or are fatalistic.
So U.S. public health initiatives are based on these values, even if not shared locally.
Which can lead to projects collapsing once the Americans leave. Now, Chapter 7, Perception of Self. For Americans, self is based on doing, independent, self-reliant.
Each one doing his own thing, a subjective, private, self-coordinating activity. So American identity built from inside out, individual focus.
Right. Contrasting with, say, the German self, stressing history, social realities language, tradition integrated into identity. The source calls the American self remarkably lacking in community, tradition.
An empty self filled by doing, by self-actualization.
That's the description. Whereas the German identity is seen as full, dependent on becoming, knowing, feeling.
And the Chinese self rooted in family lineage. Past, present, future actions of the family define the self.
Yes, much broader than the typical American focus on the nuclear family now.
Japanese selfhood is complex. Hane and tatme.
Private feelings, hane, versus the social face, tadahem. Self is inseparable from social face, obligations. Continuity comes from fulfilling obligations.
Not like Americans participating in groups as individuals.
Exactly. Americans don't usually derive their core identity from the group interaction itself.
So Americans have a primary self as individual human being. Using narrower roles like job or family as secondary allows more freedom.
That's the idea. While other cultures might have narrower social selves, job, family define you more, leading to more defined interactions.
And Americans get confused when self isn't located in the individual.
Yeah, when actions are driven by family needs, like Asian students, or preserving face, Japanese colleagues, group affiliation can trump personal goals.
The American ideal of self-reliance is a mythic individualism, breaking free.
Contrasting sharply with Chinese prized independence or Japanese viewing leaving home like joining a monastery, dependence is often a virtue elsewhere.
Americans dislike group identification being applied to them. Resistance to authority based on status.
Preferring authority that's masked, informal, allowing the illusion of personal choice. It's about protecting that subjective, private self.
but okay with authority over things, processes, resources.
which allows cooperation despite disagreements, because people are viewed somewhat fragmented based on achievement. Ascriptive cultures react to the whole person, making cooperation harder with those holding different beliefs.
Actions outside work affect workplace attitudes more broad,
Potentially, yes.
in separating actions, thoughts, intentions, and evaluation. Good intentions can excuse bad actions in U.S. view.
Whereas non-Western views might not differentiate. Wrong thoughts censured, wrong actions remembered despite intent.
The chapter ends mentioning bureaucratic individualism, deferring decisions to experts' agencies.
A growing trend noted in the source, yes. Okay, Chapter 8, focusing on intercultural communication applications. Now we apply all this understanding of deep American culture, assumptions, values, to actual communication.
Right. Knowing the deep stuff isn't enough. You need the procedural culture, the how-to.
Exactly. It starts with emotion. Sympathy versus empathy.
Sympathy is feeling how I would feel. Empathy is understanding how they feel based on their context.
Precisely. Sympathy works with shared values, but empathy is crucial cross-culturally because it respects the differences.
Like Japanese preferring to sit alongside, shared perception, versus Americans opposite, shared experience, sympathy-based.
Yeah, and Japanese communication expectations are tied to social structure. So Americans might lean sympathy, but empathy is better interculturally.
The American style of communication focused on cooperation, sharing info.
Broadly, yes. The chapter looks at 4 functions: expressive, persuasive, referential, phatic.
Expressive,
Yeah.
like the Moscow poetry reading example. One way, artist-focused.
Contrasted with American preference for dialogue and Soviet emphasis on artists for life meaning.
Persuasive, American direct, fact-based. Others value trust relationship first.
Often, yes, build rapport before trying to convince.
Referential, conveying info. American clarity, explicitness, low context.
Yes, speaker responsible for clarity. Contrasted with high context cultures, Asian, Arab, Latin American, relying on context, nonverbals, listener interpretation.
So low context, speaker's job, to be clear. High context, listener's job to understand implicitly.
That's the core idea. Japanese value nonverbal sincerity over just verbal skill.
Though even in high context, status matters. High-ranking senders might anticipate questions.
Good point. And in egalitarian U.S., students ask professors for clarity, shared responsibility.
Phatic, small talk. Americans less focused on it due to efficiency focus.
Compared to cultures where extended pleasantries are more important for rapport, yes.
American style is also very personal, relying on own experience.
Yes, finding common experiences is key to building relationships, having a lot in common. Shared action experience is often the basis, more than shared thinking initially.
Direct, explicit style plus personal focus is more self-revelation.
Often, yeah. Which Europeans might see as shallow, while Americans see European reticence as arrogant.
And informal, linked to equality,
Mm-hmm.
casual conversation across classes.
Very characteristic. First names readily used a sign of respect, treating everyone same, can make expressing deeper attachment tricky later, or even feel depersonalizing if applied universally.
Okay, the implications of American ethnocentrism. Interpreting others through your own cultural lens.
Which prevents objective understanding. You might fail to even see meaning or events in other cultures, like Americans in Tokyo only seeing similarities to U.S. cities.
Or Japanese tourists in U.S. focusing on differences like open spaces.
Exactly. Ethnocentrism relies on stereotypes, rigid beliefs as a defense mechanism, and just simple contact doesn't always help. It can worsen stereotypes.
Believing your communication style is natural leads to negative judgments of others.
Definitely. Causes defensive reactions, mutual negative evaluations, procedural culture blindness.
Like Americans seeing Japanese indirectness as ambiguous, Japanese seeing American directness as immature.
And it spirals down. Ambiguous, evasive, dishonest, immature, impolite, offensive. Trying to compensate can make it worse.
The chapter gave examples Nigerian, Arab, Thai, British clashes.
Highlighting different expectations and styles leading to misunderstanding.
Procedural ethnocentrism, applying your own culture's solutions.
Which is often ineffective, like the American student expecting Dutch treat in Japan.
Or the Peace Corps imposing their water system priority over the desired school building in Micronesia.
Right. Imposing your approach despite local preferences. Finally, empathy and action. Full empathy might hinder needed change. Better to integrate new ideas into existing patterns.
Like the green manuring project in India.
Yeah.
Failed initially.
Yes, because they ignored local leadership and values. succeeded only when they understood the real leader, the Brahmin, and framed it within his beliefs, nonviolence, nature connection.
Required adjusting their own approach, communication style, self-definition.
Had to be more meek, indirect. It shows the depth of adaptation sometimes needed.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we've really covered a lot of ground on U.S.-Japan cultural differences. Communication, thinking, social relations, self-perception.
Yeah, and the key takeaway is that these aren't just surface-level things. They stem from really deep assumptions and values. Understanding them is absolutely crucial for effective interaction.
Whether it's business, diplomacy, or just personal connection.
Absolutely vital.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener. In this world that's getting smaller, more connected every day, how can really digging into these cultural nuances, like the ones between the U.S. and Japan we've talked about, help us build better collaborations and, frankly, just misunderstand each other less on a global scale? Something to think about. We definitely encourage you to keep exploring these fascinating cultural dynamics.